Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's web conference. This is Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic is Application Lifecycle Management. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, we ask that you please disconnect your browser at this time. Attendees may access the web conference recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. We encourage you to use the messages panel at any time to ask questions regarding content or to request support. To do so, please click on the messages button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the white text box, and click send. Our presenter, Chris, is going to be holding all your questions until after the presentation, but please feel free to submit them throughout the session. We also use that messages tab to post announcements to the audience. Please take a look there now for some important information regarding this event. Ladies and gentlemen, our event production team strives to be a leader in delivering online content. We ask that you please help us reach this goal by providing feedback. Towards the end of the session, a survey URL is going to appear on the left-hand side of your screen. Simply click that URL, enter your email, and select your responses. We appreciate the time you take to do this, and thank you for your support. I'd also like to thank you for your patience during those announcements. There's going to be a brief pause while we start the recordings. Hello and welcome to today's web conference. This is Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic, Application Lifecycle Management. Presenting today from Microsoft, we have Chris Knowles, who is a Senior FastTrack Program Manager. Chris, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending today. Just wanted to apologize very quickly in advance. I seem to wake up with a little bit of crud this morning, so if you hear me go on mute or have to stop momentarily just to kind of cough, that would be why, and I will resume as quickly as possible after that. So again, I thank you for joining. We're going to talk about application lifecycle management, and as Janice said, I am part of the Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement FastTrack team here at Microsoft. So on we go. Today we're going to talk about topics related to application lifecycle management. The first one will be determining your application lifecycle management model. To address that, we will discuss the concept of Dynamics 365 environment and instances. We'll talk some about the development with Dynamics 365 customer engagement. We will discuss solution concepts for both development and deployment. We'll discuss a little bit about your development team process as well. And then we'll do a development process walkthrough. And then at the end of our session, we will address things via Q&A. So how do you determine your application lifecycle management model? Well, the things that are important in looking at that, first of all, are the environment. And when we say environment, what we typically mean is your Office 365 tenant or tenants, the Dynamics 365 customer engagement instances within that tenant, understanding kind of what the tenant model is and what instances are, as well as understanding the Dynamics 365 development architecture. As part of that as well, you want to think about your development model. So the big concept within Dynamics 365 customer engagement is solutions and how to do development with solutions, how to manage solutions. We'll discuss a little bit about configuration and customization and what those mean, and we'll talk a little bit about release management. As well, you want to think about what a simple solution model is when you go to make your decision in terms of how you're going to manage your ALM. And then lastly, talk a little bit about deployment options and the tools that are available there. So in understanding tenants and instances with Dynamics 365, when you get your initial purchase, you should have an Office 365 tenant that has one production Dynamics 365 instance. Now, it won't be provisioned necessarily. You'll have to go in and provision that yourself. And one non-production Dynamics 365 instance, which we refer to as a sandbox. We do cover this topic in a lot more detail in our tenant administration and operation Tech Talk. So if you get a chance, go and listen to one of the pre-recorded Tech Talks on that topic, or check that out the next time that it's scheduled. You'll also have your Dynamics 365 user licenses, storage, and then, of course, all of this should already be provisioned, or at least ready for you to provision. You may have other services in there as well, like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Skype for Business. These are all just important to understand from an integration perspective as you move forward. Now, when we talk about instances versus the tenant, the concept of an instance is something that lives within your Office 365 tenant. We typically recommend that you consider what we call a single tenant model for your development, unless your IT or infra security policies require that you use more than one. So typically, when customers look at their application lifecycle management model or their ALM model, they'll leverage somewhere between 3 and 5 instances. They'll have a development instance. Potentially, they'll have a QA and a user acceptance testing or an integration instance. They may have an integration test instance or staging instance, and then finally their production instance. One of the important things to think about is that you may have multiple instances, but when you have storage, the storage that you have and that you've purchased and that's included with your Dynamics 365 customer engagement licenses is for all instances within the tenant. It's always something to consider as you think about how much data you want to keep. Do you want to keep a full copy of production in your UAT, or just a small copy with enough test data for your users to always exercise their scenarios? Those are the types of things that you should think about when you look at this. So what does an instance model look like? So if you have multiple instances that you're using for your ALM, you can set each instance up to mimic some portion of your full production environment, so that as you run through the process of moving from the different stages of your development cycle, you have the ability to validate more and more functionality. And here, just as an example, I'm showing things like on-prem and third-party integrations, Azure services, SharePoint Online, and Exchange Online. So you can have these different levels of integration, and then you may progressively add more as you work your way through the life cycle prior to your production deployment. And this is just something, again, it's unique to every customer and how they choose to do it, whether you use stub integrations early on in dev and QA, for example, and then turn those into the real integrations or into a test integration environment as you move forward into UAT or int or getting ready for your production environment. But this is what a model would potentially look like. Now here I've got 5 instances, but as you can see, I'm showing that the QA, the UAT, and the int are optional. These are extra instances that you would have to potentially acquire if you wanted to follow this type of model. And there's the single tenant model that I was referring to with the different levels of integration. Now, the other concept that we discuss sometimes is what we call a multi-tenant model. When we talk about a tenant, again, that is an Office 365 tenant. It will have its own services, and each one is completely self-contained. So here, as you can see in the model, there is a tenant that has the dev and QA, as well as associated storage. It has its own SharePoint Online instance and its own Exchange Online instance. And then, of course, there's another one that has both UAT, int, and prod. And it also has a SharePoint Online instance and an Exchange Online instance. One of the reasons that we recommend a single tenant model versus a multi-tenant model is because there are some things you have to consider when you look at doing multi-tenant development. For example, if you're going to federate, each tenant has to be associated with a separate domain within your identity provider. So, for example, if you have a production tenant, that would be contoso.com. If you had a development or a test tenant, that would be contosodev or contosotest.com. Each tenant does require its own user IDs, licenses, and storage. So if you haven't necessarily accounted for this, with your account team, you should talk to them and make sure that they understand if you have to go single tenant or multi-tenant. Again, as I mentioned before, user IDs are different between these two tenant environments. So when you set up service accounts, you'll have to make sure that you set service accounts up in each of those tenants for those instances to do what you need to do. Additionally, we don't have any out-of-the-box integration components that would automatically drive integration between tenants or between instances within a tenant. You can build that type of integration, but we don't have anything out of the box that necessarily automatically supports that. And then you're not able to integrate from an Office 365 tenant to other Office 365 services that are in another tenant. And the reason this is important is because if you have to have a test tenant and you want to test SharePoint Online, you're going to have a SharePoint Online instance in that test tenant. So just from a licensing perspective and a usage perspective, those are the types of things that you have to consider, and one of the reasons that we recommend a single tenant model over a multi-tenant model. So when we talk about development with Dynamics 365 customer engagement, what do we really mean? So as you can see here on the screen, there's a couple of different aspects to developing within the platform and external to the platform. We do offer a web API that is fully REST compliant, and it supports interaction with things like Node.js, Angular, Java, etc. You also have the ability to develop internally, where you can do customizations and configuration within the platform. That's primarily where we're going to focus today in this discussion, is using the platform to do development. But there are options that you can leverage depending on how you want to interact with Dynamics 365, and you should take those into consideration as you look for designing your ALM model. So when we talk about development in Dynamics 365, one of the things, if you're not familiar with development at all with Dynamics, is that we primarily drive everything in what we call solutions. With our latest release, we've actually created what we call first-party solutions for sales, customer service, field service, and professional services automation. This is really important because it actually helps us to have much more dynamic and effective release cycles that are encapsulated by functional area versus making changes that may be more pervasive across different solution sets. This also makes it easier for you to have greater control over the customizations and configuration that you potentially make in each of those areas. We've also introduced a custom control solution that has a lot of new custom controls that you can actually leverage on your forms to give you much more control and much more dynamic capabilities within the forms that you create for your solution. And then when you look at the solutions, when you go to actually create your instances, you can actually choose which of these solutions you'd like to install, and then you just want to make sure that the license type that you have supports the solutions that you're installing. Normally they do, and that's all taken care of ahead of time, but it's just something to keep into consideration. When we talk about doing development within Dynamics, as I said before, everything is done with solutions. So solutions are the simplest way to manage how you can migrate configuration and customization from your development environment to your other instances that you may choose to have. They can be installed, again, as I said before, from Microsoft. Your partner may provide you with solutions, or you may choose to bring in solutions from an ISV through our, through our AppSource functionality, where you can go out and actually find solutions that are out there for different types of functionality. If you wanted to, the most simple form of developing within Dynamics would be to do development of what we call the default solution. This is basically just a large pool of configuration that contains all of your changes, and it exists in what we call a large unmanaged solution. We do recommend that you consider a combination of both unmanaged and managed solutions for your implementation. And typically what we mean by that is we say develop unmanaged, deploy managed. So in your development solution, you would have your unmanaged solutions that exist there. You then extract those as managed solutions and deploy them in your subsequent environments. So when we talk about doing development within the platform, typically that means configuration and customization. And the reason that understanding the difference, the reason that understanding the difference between these is important is because they're very different types of development. Configuration consists of creating entities, relationships, workflows, forms, views, dashboards, visualizations, and other things. Customization is typically where you leverage the ability to extend or augment functionality that exists in the platform. And there's two types of customization that you can consider when you're looking at customization in Dynamics 365. One is server-side. Typically, when we say server-side, these are things like plugins, custom workflow activities, custom actions. These all have to be built using .NET and the SDK assemblies because what's required there is that it lives on the server side of the application, which is in the hosted environment. On the client side, you can also use JavaScript to add functionality at the form level, as well as bring in the custom controls that I mentioned earlier, as well as your own potential custom controls, web resources, those types of things. So these are primarily the big differences in terms of the types of development that happen within Dynamics, and it's just important to understand how they're brought together using the solution model, as well as how they apply within the environment that you're developing for. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that's really important is understanding the concept of solutions for development and deployment within Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So solutions are packages that contain configurations, customizations, and settings. They're always authored by a publisher, and they're very useful for containerizing the groups of functionality, and then this simplifies again the management of how this is all brought together and how you can migrate all of this to different environments so that it's not very complex. And then here you can see we actually show the different types of components that exist within a solution. So from a schema perspective, you have entities, attributes, relationships, global option sets. I won't read them all, but you can see the different areas where we have components that make up all of our solutions, and we'll talk more about this as we go along. As I had mentioned before, there are two types of solutions, both managed and unmanaged. And the reason that having them this way is important is because it really helps you in terms of how you do your development, and then how you can containerize that development to deploy effectively, as well as, for example, if you happen to deploy a solution and there's something wrong, you have more options in terms of how you can then undo that change, correct it from a break fix perspective, or as you're doing your cycles of testing, do validation, and then very easily and quickly maintain additional changes and updates. So when you look at managed solutions, this is typically for a final distribution of components. Though when we say final, it doesn't necessarily mean that it sits only in your production environment. You may also want to have the managed solutions exist in your QA environment, in your UAT environment, and again, it typically is going to be the environment where you are not making changes to those solutions. Once you've imported a managed solution, it cannot be changed unless, of course, the properties of the solution allow you to make changes to it. But typically, as I said before, we recommend that you don't make changes where the solution is managed. You make changes where the solution is unmanaged, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Again, once you have imported a managed solution into an environment, it cannot be exported. That doesn't mean that it can't be deleted or uninstalled. It simply means that you cannot then export that solution to then import it somewhere else. And then, of course, if you have to delete a managed solution, it does uninstall all of the solution components and then any related parts of that solution that exist within the broader environment. And from an unmanaged solution perspective, all solutions start as an unmanaged solution. These can be modified. Again, it's a container that holds references to all of the components that make up the solution. You could have multiple unmanaged solutions. And of course, again, it allows you to do a logical grouping of solutions to kind of structure how you may want to do your development and manage your development process. Publishers, very simple. A publisher is how you can track who is the author of that particular solution. A lot of times this is handy if you have different people working on different solutions, or if you have multiple people in an environment. You can typically tell that by using the publisher who the last person was that was responsible for managing that particular solution. And then, of course, when you create a solution, this is all done within the tool. You can identify a publisher, and then you can go and you can actually create a solution within the tool so that you can identify, here is the next thing I am going to use to have my container of components for things I'm going to develop. And you can just define this within the platform. There's nothing special you have to do. You can also do this programmatically. We won't discuss that in a lot of detail here, but there's a lot of information on our developer's guide for version 9. within our Docs platform that gives you a lot more detailed information on doing this. And then, of course, if you want to update solutions, just some things to take into consideration. If you update an unmanaged solution, those changes cannot be uninstalled. And typically this refers to what we call the large default solution, but it could be any solution that's unmanaged, something you have to consider when you're making changes to those solutions. If the components exist, whatever is put in with a new solution will overwrite those unmanaged solution components. Now, for managed solutions, as we discussed, they can't be changed. If you uninstall them, there is the possibility that data would be deleted, but not always. Updating those solutions versus continually reinstalling is what we recommend is the best approach or a best practice. You have the ability to release a new version of the solution or a patch. So you actually have some control over versioning within the solution in terms of as you move forward, whether you're doing very simple small break fixes as a patch, or whether you're actually doing in a release cycle, a new release of your solution, which would be like an upgrade. If you put an update in, of course, it can be rolled back by simply reinstalling or uninstalling that specific solution. So again, just to highlight, when you go and you delete a solution, it's important to understand that for unmanaged solutions, all it does is delete the solution record in the database. It doesn't change any of the components. For a managed solution, if you delete the solution, it will uninstall the whole managed solution that exists, including all of its components. Any customizations that have been made to that solution would also be uninstalled within that environment. A lot of times you'll find that you may, as you're doing a process, if you're working with a partner or if you're working with an ISV, you may find that you'll get a solution from them that's managed, that's in your development environment, that's maybe some custom IP that they have. You would be able to customize on top of that, but you wouldn't be able to actually open that particular managed solution in your development environment. So when you export solutions, what does that mean? When we talk about exporting solutions, the idea is that you can actually extract a solution from an environment. If, for example, you need to look at the customizations XML file, we don't typically recommend that you edit this file by hand. There are lots of tools that allow you to work with this file, but you can also export them to move an unmanaged solution to a new organization, or you can use it to make changes in a new organization, or you can create a backup of your current customizations. For managed solutions, a managed solution can't be exported, but you would export from an unmanaged to managed. And then, of course, as it says here, they're only created while you're exporting from an unmanaged solution. These are, again, just concepts that are very important to understand as you look at how you are dealing with solutions and managing them. So once you've exported a solution, what would you do with it? Well, you would import the solution. Typically, when you want to import a solution, you're just moving customizations into a new organization. When you import it, because it's unmanaged, it would be customizable. And then, of course, any changes that applied as part of the import or post-import can't be uninstalled. When you import a managed solution, the solution definition is locked, and it does not allow any changes to that solution, but you can allow people to make changes on top of that solution. If you want to restore or revert to a previous version of the solution, that's when using managed solutions are very powerful. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of how you have a little bit more granularity of control for solutions is to use what we call a clone to patch. The idea is this is a very simple and light form of the solution. It doesn't carry around all of the solution components. All you're doing is bringing a small piece in. For example, if you need to make changes to a form in your solution in a break fix model, all you would need to do is clone your base solution to a patch, and then you can take that patch, make changes that you need to make to it, and then you're able to import that patch into your subsequent solutions once you've verified and validated that everything is okay. It's a very useful tool. Again, clone to solution, this is when you're going to work on an entirely new version of that solution, more like an upgrade, if you will, where it's much more comprehensive. and you have the ability to use the clone to solution. It again gives you versioning control so that you now have maybe version 1.2 of your solution versus version 1.1, or even a version 2, for example, depending on where you're going. And then as you can see the difference both with a patch and then with the larger solution model, how these look within the solution view in the tool. So another concept that's very important to take into consideration is merging. And merging is critical to understand because this is how solutions layer together within the environment. So as you can see here, basically, when you start to look at application behavior, you have an entity, a sitemap, a template, and of course a web resource. Now, as you're looking at the different solutions that layer in here, you can see how different solutions at different versions layer together and create a more comprehensive picture, and then how the platform makes decisions on what version of the component it's going to use when of course you're executing functionality. So it's really critical to understand how that's done there and what that looks like. Sometimes when you're working with a solution, you find that you have to deal with a conflict with components, and a lot of times when this happens, especially for example, you may have two different developers working on a particular form, and sometimes those differences have to be merged. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our process walkthrough. But just to understand that when you're dealing with solutions and when you're dealing with multiple developers developing in solutions, you do have to understand how to resolve conflict and how that works. So just make sure that you understand when you're looking at this, and you're looking at the concept of solution management, make sure that you invest some time in, again, understanding how conflict is both identified and resolved within the platform. So when we talk about deploying changes, this is where understanding how you're going to implement your ALM model with multiple instances becomes very important. So in the example here, we have basically three instances. We have our development instance, our UAT instance, and then our live production environment. So I take my version 1.0, I've got it done, I've got it developed, I'm ready to have it tested. So I do what I need to do from a development perspective. I package it up, I export it, I take the managed version of my solution, and I migrate that into my user acceptance testing environment. My users test it. They're not real thrilled about it. They give me a lot of feedback. So we go through and we make changes. And then once I have my changes done and fixed, then what I do is I migrate that into my UAT environment. At this point, they like what they see. Everything looks good. And it looks like we're ready to move on to production. So then I take version 1.1 that I have migrated into my UAT environment, and I take that same version of 1.1 managed solution because everything is good, and I migrate that into my production environment. And then, of course, everything's good, and I'm good to go. And I've already started working on my version 1.2 in my dev environment. Everything's okay there, and it doesn't impact at all what I'm doing. So just to reiterate, very clean, very simple process to manage, combines using both unmanaged and managed solutions, and it makes this process very simple. And we'll talk more about some of the tools that are in this process, as well as how this process works in a little bit more detail when we do the walkthrough. So another thing to understand and think about when you're looking at developing for Dynamics is your development teams. It's always good to make sure that you have an effective team structure in terms of who's responsible for what, how things are being developed. Today everybody's using some form of agile development. So this is very easily supportable within Dynamics. You just have to make sure that as you're doing this, especially for teams that tend to be a bit larger, that you have a good entity and component governance model, and that you have a solid management of your solution model for this development activity to go on. In terms of organizing teams and how they look like, there's a great article. There's a great article that we published called "Organize Your Teams to Develop Solutions." This provides some information. We'll discuss a little bit of the information that's in that article later, but there is a lot of information within our doc site around solution development, using teams, using tools, etc. So make sure that you check that out. In terms of looking at your development teams, one of the things that I like to recommend for all of my customers is that even though they may have a partner, it's very important for them to make sure their in-house development teams either have or are in the process of gaining knowledge around Dynamics 365 customer engagement really prior to commencing application design. And the reason that this is important is because it helps you as the customer, or even as a partner or endeavor, to understand the concepts as you're looking at the ways that you're going to implement functionality. This is critical in terms of thinking about how you want to address some very critical things. Now, of course, you know how you go about doing this. Your partner may, as part of your implementation, do some knowledge transfer and help you understand it that way. You may also partner with your partner during your implementation, so you'll grow your knowledge that way. Then it would also be good to consider looking at training specifically for your resources. And of course, there's a link here on the slide that takes you to a link that talks more about training with Dynamics 365 customer engagement and developer-oriented training. And then, of course, for any developer, it's critical to kind of understand where everything is, where's the encapsulated information. And as part of our version 9, we no longer distribute what we call our SDK as a package. It no longer comes in a big zip file. Everyone goes to our developer guide for Dynamics 365 customer engagement, and that is our SDK. It contains all of our links to sample code. It contains links to templates for Visual Studio. It contains links to documentation for different types of customization and configuration. Everything that you need to know as a developer, that is the place to start for Dynamics 365 customer engagement. And then, of course, what types of, one of the questions I get a lot is what types of knowledge do people need to have to really do development within Dynamics? So the first one I think is the most important is product knowledge. And this really consists of general functionality knowledge. For example, what are leads, opportunities, accounts and contacts? How do you use them? And then, of course, what are the configuration concepts for entities and forms, creating views, establishing relationships between entities, business processes, workflows, dashboards, etc. These are all critical elements of just understanding how the product works and how the functionality is delivered. And then, of course, the next level of that is the platform. This would include understanding our security model. We've talked some about solution development and solution management. That's critical. What is metadata? How does it apply to things that are being developed? The software development kit, the SDK, that's really more, again, the developer guide, but where that is, all that's contained in it, all the information that it provides for you, what are the different tool sets that are available to you, the web API, Azure development, as well as doing integration for things like Exchange, SharePoint, and other tools. And then, of course, data migration and integration, potentially any external integration and custom applications. So these are all critical elements of interacting with the platform that are good to at least have a good basic understanding of before you really dig down deep into development with customer engagement. And then, of course, web development for client-side customizations, JavaScript, just understanding how things are delivered with HTML5 and CSS. Our form API, again, leveraging the web API from JavaScript. All of this focuses on client-side customization for forms and client-side integrations. And then, of course, if you're going to do server-side development for plugins, custom actions, custom workflow activities, you need to understand .NET development using C#. This is critical because this is the way you build the most efficient code to be implemented on the server side. And we provide you with templates to do that. Of course, you know there's lots of sample code as well that helps you understand how all of that is done with that comes with the developer guide. And then lastly, understanding things in terms of application development for Azure, Power Apps, and of course, Microsoft Flow. So when you look at development teams, what are some models that we recommend? We get this question a lot. So it's hard to identify, any particular model, but there are three that we highlight and sometimes talk about. So what we call our single organization development, or one master solution. And the idea is that there is a development instance that everyone is working out of. There's one main solution. There could be sub-solutions under that, but there's one main solution. And then, of course, that solution always represents what's being developed at the time. Then another variant on that model is multiple developer solutions, and then there's a single master solution that encapsulates these. Now, a lot of times this is used when you break your solutions up into different types of functional areas, maybe different entities. Maybe you have somebody who does sales, someone else who does customer service, or maybe it's more granular within those areas, or maybe somebody does forms, somebody else does the entity management, and relationships and those types of things. Someone does forms, potentially web resources, other things like that. There are lots of ways that you can break up the different components within a solution and then encapsulate those into a single master solution. And then lastly, one organization per developer. This is where a developer has their entire organization that they are responsible for developing. And then, of course, all of that then is brought together in a larger consolidated model. And then what tools are available for you? Here, there's three main tools that we talk about. Our solution packager, which basically allows you to pull solutions, pull components together and create a solution package. And conversely, it allows you to take a solution and break it apart into different pieces. And we will talk more about the solution packager. Another one is the package deployer. And this is one that actually allows you to define all the concepts of the package that have been put together by the solution packager and then deploy them into the Dynamics environment. Very helpful and useful for migration. And of course, using Visual Studio as an example, which we'll discuss in the walkthrough for source control. So when we look at solution concepts, I apologize. There we go. Get ourselves caught back up. So when we look at solution concepts, when we talked about the package deployer, I just want to give you a little bit of information around the package deployer so that you have an understanding of it. It really is a very simple mechanism for packing your solutions and custom deployment code if necessary for what you're going to do. It allows you to migrate those groups of solutions or that package from one environment to another. You just need to make sure that you have all of your solutions and associated files ready to include in the package. Leverages the .NET Framework 4.5.2 or higher. You can do it on Visual Studio 2012, 13, or 15. You would need to have the NuGet package manager for those versions of Visual Studio. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you've got the templates for Visual Studio that contain the package template that allows you to actually put all this together. There's a link here on this particular page that references where you can download those, and it tells you the file to click on to install those templates within Visual Studio. So when you're dealing with the package deployer, just some very simple guidance on best practices. You want to make sure when you're creating packages that developers make sure that their assemblies they're creating are signed. Very critical from a security perspective. And then, of course, when you're deploying the packages, administrators want to make sure that the package contains those signed assemblies so that you can always track an assembly back to where it was sourced or it was created. That the package is tested in a pre-production instance. Whether it's a mirror image of the production instance or not from a data perspective is not as relevant as making sure that it's a mirror image from a functionality perspective so that you can validate the behavior of that, of course. And then lastly, making sure that the production instance is backed up before you deploy the new package. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the development process and do a walkthrough. So before I proceed into that, Janice, are there any questions?
No questions as yet.
Okay, excellent. So then we will proceed. So when you're working with Solution Packager, one of the things to really understand is what role Solution Packager plays for you and what it does. And as I mentioned before, it has two main capabilities. One is to unpack solutions and another is to pack solutions. So when we say unpack, basically what this does is this extracts the components from an exported solution and basically can break them apart, and then you actually have the ability to put them in different places. And then, of course, when you pack solutions using the solution packager, you are pointing it to all these places where it's expecting things to be unpacked, and then it pulls them and puts them all back together, and it creates that solution, and it's ready to be imported into Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So when we consider the development process, it's important to understand that as you flow through the development process, the idea is that a normal development cycle, you're going to take things, you're going to make changes, you're going to get things ready to go, you're going to do some testing, and then you're going to do a migration. So as we're talking through this process, this is basically the way we're going to do this. We'll just orient this specifically to the tools that we have available. So what does this round look like? So the very first time that you go through this process, or any time that you're kind of starting out, you want to make sure the very first time that you do it, that you create your solution structure. And this is basically how you're going to break out the components. Sometimes this revolves around ownership. Who's going to own these different pieces that you can then pull back together? Maybe they're in sub-solutions, or they're broken out into different component folders for easy maintenance and management within Visual Studio. You also want to make sure that you create the solution structure within Dynamics 365 and Visual Studio so that they're aligned. Then once you've done this and you've created this environment within Visual Studio out of your Dynamics environment, you then bring it back in Dynamics. You do some customizations within the platform. For example, we recommend that you don't try to manipulate the XML by hand in Visual Studio for form changes, that you actually do that within the platform and then extract your solution out. Once you've done that, then you are actually at a place where you can extract all of that solution information out. You can do it using code, or you can use tools. Once you've done the extraction, you would then basically put that into the appropriate folders in Visual Studio, and then you would check that into Visual Studio. And at that point, if you had additional things to work on within Visual Studio, for example, updating a plugin or creating new plugins, or possibly changing or deprecating functionality as well, you can do that type of functionality within Visual Studio. So again, as I said, you just basically walk through the process of defining a solution structure. You want to make sure that you create the solution structure within Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement as well as Visual Studio. You will then customize your solution within Dynamics 365 for things like adding entities, adding forms, adding views, creating relationships, doing all of that type of work. Then you would export that solution. You would use that export to have it broken up into Visual Studio, and then check all of those different components into Visual Studio. So when you define the solution structure, as we talked about before, our solution structure for the sake of this example is we're going to have one solution that's called name of the solution underbar client extension. This will contain our web resources, JavaScript, images, icons, anything else that we may have that's part of the client extension environment. Then we'll have another solution that contains our data model, anything for entities, forms, views, any type of visualizations, fields, additional keys, relationships, business rules, etc. And then, of course, if it's necessary where you have potential JavaScript libraries or other web resources, those would be included here. Our sitemap, which is basically our navigation view, as well as application ribbons, that's another solution. Then we have a security solution that has our roles, possibly field security profiles and connection roles, as well as templates. Very important here that we may have article templates, for example, or we may have email templates, or even contract templates that we want to make sure that we're maintaining. We'll have potentially reports, plugins, and processes, and each of these are unique solution containers within our broader solution structure. Once we do this and we create the solution structure, we want to make sure that it's the same when we actually create these and we align them between Dynamics 365 and Visual Studio. Once we've done that, then everything we know will be able to migrate cleanly as part of the process. So now, I've done all this work to create the structure. I now go back into Dynamics 365 in the platform, and I start making my customizations that I need to make, or configurations, everything that I need to do. I get everything created, and now I'm done with all of that, and I'm ready to move forward from customizing my solutions. So then I export the solution. Now, as I mentioned before, you can export the solution just by using the tool, or you can export the solution using code. You can do it either way. There's nothing specifically that requires you to do it one way or another. Some people will use code because it enables them to begin the stages of automating this type of functionality, where you can actually begin to create an automated management and deployment process for your ALM. So once you've extracted the solution, you then want to unpack it for Visual Studio, and that we would do with our solution packager. So when you go and you actually run the solution packager, you would just specify the switch that can extract the solution. So you're telling packager, I want you to extract, not package. And then, of course, you will specify a folder that contains the pointers to which the different areas are extracted, and you use the solution packager to do that. And then, of course, it will put those directly into folders that Visual Studio is aware of in the structure that you created within Visual Studio. Now, when that's done and you've extracted everything to your folders within your Visual Studio project, you then want to make sure and go check in all of those components so that they're now checked in to Visual Studio from either the brand new version where it starts to 1.0, or potentially it's an updated version. Now, once that's done, basically that's it. You have the ability then to go in and finish your development within Visual Studio. You'll follow this process and then do what you need to do. But as you then go through, you want to work your way through the process of being able to walk backwards through getting everything back into the system and then working to deploy it. So when you're ready to go and work on that version of Visual Studio, just in case there's been work going on that you weren't aware of, you then want to make sure that you get into Visual Studio and get the latest version. Once you've done that, you would use the solution packager to basically put everything back together as a solution package, using the switch to say, I no longer want to extract, I want you to pack. And then it will go, and based on the folders that you've identified as part of that group of solutions for what you're packaging together, it will pull all of the contents together. And then, of course, at the point that you've done this, you have a version of the solution now that represents the most recent version that came out of Visual Studio and has been checked out for modification. You then import your solution. And once you've pulled all of this together, you can use our package deployer to actually deploy the solution package within Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement. And the link here gives you more information on using the package deployer. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Again, a lot of information in terms of helping you understand what the package deployer does and the best way to use it. Now, of course, you've got your next version of your solution that you've now checked out in Visual Studio. You've packaged it together. You've brought it back into Dynamics 365 in your development instance there. You now create the version of this. Whatever other changes you want to make sure that everything is there. It may be that you don't do any additional customizations at this point, but that you've brought the solution back into Dynamics 365 just to validate that everything else is good. Maybe plugins were added the last time things were changed. And then, of course, when this is done and you want to make sure that everything is ready to go and locked down, the developer is connected to TFS. They get the latest versions. And then, of course, they make sure that they get them into Package Deployer. And if there's any customizations that have to be done, the developer can follow the steps necessary to kind of go through and export the solutions and extract them and do what they need to do so that they have the latest versions. Now, at this point, it is possible that you may run into some conflicts depending on the number of developers and who owns what, but potentially, if this does happen, There's certainly an easy way to identify these within Visual Studio so that you understand how to resolve those conflicts, and you can use the merge tool within Visual Studio to do this fairly easily. And as you can see here in our example, when we actually do a merge comparison of what's been changed within the Visual Studio environment, we can see that there are differences. We can simply then instruct Visual Studio to do the merge. And then, of course, once this is done, you now have a completed version. You can simply finalize this within Visual Studio. You can then, once all of this is finalized and everything is checked back in as completed and verified, you can then use the package deployer to extract this out and then take that to the solution packager to put everything back together as a solution. And then you can use that package deployer to package it back into your development environment before you then are finalized with it. And then you can take it and extract it out and put it into subsequent environments as a managed solution for developing. So again, there's a lot of things in terms of dealing with this process and understanding how things work, connecting them together using Visual Studio. I would highly encourage you to please check out the link references that are included within this, and make sure that you clearly understand how all of these processes and steps work together. But if you can follow this process and you can create a structure that allows your development team to cleanly work on different parts and components of the solution, you'll find that your development process goes much easier and much cleaner. And at that point, that's our development walkthrough, and that's pretty much everything, at least to kind of get you going in terms of using solutions, creating an application lifecycle management model, and doing so within Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Chris. We don't have any questions at the moment, so ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to submit a question for Chris, go ahead and type that into the white text box and click submit, and we'll address those. In the meantime, I'd like to bring your attention to a link that I posted in the messages panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you would like to provide some feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, or you would like to submit topics for future web conferences, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And I am not seeing anything come into the Q&A. So, Chris, are there any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. Janice, thank you as well for all of your help, and I would encourage you, please, I welcome your feedback, any comments that you have, any information that you have. We're always looking to improve this content and make sure that we're getting you the best information possible. And again, just thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
All right, thank you, Chris. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude today's web conference. Attendees can access the web conference recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Chris, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.